The Donald Mackay murder is probably one of the most notorious murders we've had in Australia's history.
He agreed to cooperate and introduce an undercover agent into the crime family, which was me.
The mafia really, it needs a full-time commitment, not just a little, part-time go at them every time a bomb goes off.
My read of their situation was that the murder of Donald Mackay was driven by personal animosity, not a business decision.
Welcome back to the Mafia's Web podcast. I'm Stephen Drill. I've travelled around Italy in the research in this podcast, speaking with some of the brave souls across the globe who are fighting to curb the Mafia's power. Sometimes they weren't always happy to see me, and I was chased out of one of the Mafia's strongholds after taking photographs. In this podcast, I'm going to look at what, if anything, can be done to stop the Mafia. This episode is looking at the biggest Mafia case in Australian history, the disappearance and suspected murder of Donald Mackay in 1977. He was an anti-drugs campaigner in Griffith, New South Wales. His disappearance and presumed death sparked 2 royal commissions. Last time, we met Roman Quadrileague, the former Commissioner of Australian Border Force, who also worked undercover early in his career.
Donald Mackay had been running around Griffith, not just in an anti-drugs crusade, because he knew that there were crops being grown and that the Italian families that were involved had grown crops and had then bought very large mansions that they called the grass castles, etc. But he was actually calling out the names of the people like the Bob Trimbolis of the world that were doing it. And those people that he was naming were living with him in this very small community. And anyone that knows anything about communities in Australia is, they are incestuous, they are intimate, and Bob Trimboli's name was being plastered all around, his community as being someone who was a criminal, who, had lost all his respect from his fellow citizens in that community. And so he was pissed off. He took it very personally. And so my read of their situation was that the murder of Donald Mackay was driven by personal animosity, not a business decision.
Bob Trimboli, who is now dead, was a major player in the Mafia in Griffith. He was suspected of being involved in the Mackay disappearance. But no one was ever charged with the murder because they could never find a body. According to Roman, the Mafia in Griffith had a glass jaw. Mackay was a Liberal Party candidate and a father of 4. He disappeared after drinking at a pub. A blood smear on a car and 3 bullet cartridges were found near the Griffith Hotel. The suspected triggerman was James Machine Gun Baisley, who died in a Melbourne nursing home in 2018. He never made a confession to police, but spent 9 years in jail for conspiracy to the murder.
The Donald Mackay murder is probably one of the most notorious murders we've had in Australia's history. It is a political murder, and it is partly unresolved to this day.
That's former New South Wales Assistant Commissioner Clive Small. Back then, there was some hope of new information. Police offered a $200,000 reward for anyone with info. Roman says there are people who do know the truth, and he has some inside information.
What really fascinated me was this Don, who was elderly at the time. He would have been in his 60s at the time. He said to me, we were talking about growing cannabis and police investigations and how he got into the business that he was in. And he told me that he was part of the council of Dons that got together to discuss whether they should do away with Donald Mackay. And he claims, and whether this is true, I don't know, or whether he was just trying to self-aggrandize, said to me, I was the only one that disagreed with the strategy to assassinate Donald Mackay, not because I was a saint or not because I had any ethical concerns, but because I thought that if we did that, we would bring police attention to Griffith. And I have been proven to be right. He goes, that was, some years ago now, but we have never been the same since that event.
The police were so close even then, but the old school code of silence stuck. He never gave anyone else up. Roman says that the Mckay case was a turning point. Police just couldn't let the case go unsolved. they were determined to crack down on the mafia in Australia. And that led him years later to do the undercover work. And what he saw was crime on an industrial scale.
So this was, just to contextualise the time, so less than 20 years after Donald Mackay was murdered, there was an opportunity. I was working in an organised crime or an anti-organised crime section with the National Crime Authority. It was set up to combat national organised crime, and it had what they called a reference, which was a particular task to tackle Italian organised crime. So that was one of the major areas of focus for the National Crime Authority. It certainly was in the mid-90s when I was with the National Crime Authority. And I had the opportunity to be introduced into this crime syndicate through an informant. The informant had been working for this Italian crime family based out of Griffith in New South Wales that were into whole-scale marijuana cultivation. And he had been employed by them as a land scout, so someone who spent a lot of time in rural areas in Western Queensland by virtue of his occupation. And he had the opportunity to identify farmers that were financially distressed and who had very large blocks of land, who would be open to an approach. And he would then play the intermediary between the Italian organised crime family and the farmer to allow the Italians to set up a marijuana cultivation on their land. And that would be for a profit share, but the way the modus operandi of this particular crime family was, if they did it once, then they had the farmer on the hook, and they would continue, despite the farmer's protestations, to grow marijuana crops on his land because they had him by the short and curlies. Anyway, this land scout had some troubles of his own, and he agreed to cooperate and introduce an undercover agent into the crime family, which was me. My role ostensibly was to be the crop supervisor. So in essence, how that works, the property was out near St. George in Western Queensland, so it was a hell of a long way out. Very, very, very remote area. And so the way the model worked is I met with the Don of the family at Toowoomba. We drove out and inspected the property. We then spent a couple of days preparing the ground, laying the irrigation piping, which the farmer had already bought, setting up the water supply, and then working through the mathematics of how many plants we could grow. Once that was done, an order would be placed, and it was placed, to Griffith. A week later, a truck full of seedlings were brought up, 7,000 seedlings were brought up into the crop and planted.
Roman says that the drug production that Mckay was fighting against was still in full swing. And he managed to get some more on the story that we mentioned earlier on who killed Mckay during that long road trip with the mafia don. I asked him how he managed to get this criminal to open up, particularly on such a sensitive case.
The informant that had introduced me was a highly trusted confidant of the group. He had been working them for a number of years, so they had no reason to doubt him. He, in the cover story that we had developed, had vouched for me as someone that he had worked with for years and years and years as well, and that I was wholly reliable. So that's point one. Now, having said that, any seasoned criminal is a little bit cautious. Point two, if you saw pictures of me at the time, you probably would have run away even in the middle of the day, let alone on a dark night. I was looking pretty scary. I had very long hair and full facial beard and earrings, and I was quite muscular because I was working out a lot. So, I did not by any means look like I was anyone other than who I purported to be, which was a very well-known Gold Coast criminal who was a crop manager. Point three, in that conversation, there was a number of hours, and clearly our coming together was purely on the basis of criminal enterprise. So that was the main topic of conversation. And as an undercover agent, we were in my car, and my car was tricked up for audio. So I wanted to get him talking. And so my job was to get him talking. And the way I elicited those types of conversations was to talk about, well, what are the security measures we're going to take around this? We don't know each other. Quite clearly, I can look after the crop end of things, but we have to communicate. And mobile phones were a thing back then, but we were already very much in the business of intercepting phone calls. So, I asked him, I said, well, how do we communicate? Because I don't want to talk on mobile phones. So, he came up with an elaborate system of payphone, et cetera, et cetera. So in all of that, I started talking about, well, have you been subject to any police attention? Because I know you're from Griffith, and that stuff that happened with Donald Mackay back then has caused a fair bit of scrutiny. How are you guys, been able to maintain your operational security? And so getting him into that conversation, that's how that came about.
The Mckay admission was a long way into that 6-hour trip, and it shocked Roman.
He was what I call old school. I actually quite liked him, Stephen. He was a wholly decent fellow, very family valued. He was an old fruit, vegetable and tobacco farmer who'd worked hard all his life. Yes, he got involved in growing marijuana and wholesale distribution, but he and I formed a very strong bond, and part of that was confected, of course, because that's what you do as a undercover agent. You try and create a rapport and you create trust and confidence, and that way you penetrate further, you find out more information.
Roman says he actually became friends with the mafia Don, but ultimately he had to do his job. After months of undercover work, there was a moment when the truth about his double life was revealed.
When the operation was concluded, we went to Griffith the night before. So over the course of a couple of days, all of the police that were involved in that particular operational closure drifted into Griffith. You can't sort of turn up all on the same afternoon because, it sends alarm bells ringing and, people go scurrying. So I came in under the cover of darkness the night before, still looking very much like I described before. And all the people were rounded up, including this fellow, and he was being interviewed by a couple of detectives. He denied anything to do with the allegations that had been put to him. In fact, he denied ever having been in Queensland for more than 20 years. And we had a word worked out which was my cue, which was sort of a cue word. And when the word was spoken, I walked through the door, and the detective said, "I would like to introduce you to one of my colleagues, Detective Sergeant Quadleague." And I walked in the door, and he looked at me, and he hung his head, and he goes, "You got me." And because it was pretty hard to deny it at that point in time. But to my point about him being old school, he never gave anyone else up.
The Mckay murder put the mafia on the map in Australia. It sparked the Woodward Royal Commission, which found in 1979 that Mackay's disappearance was organised by the Griffith-based Calabrian mafia. Trimboli, who died in 1988, has been accused of hiring Baisley, but was never charged. The hit had been planned at an isolated location in Jerilderie, but Mckay never showed up. He was shot days later in that Griffith pub car park on a Friday night at about 6:30. It's not the ideal place for a murder. Bullets that were found linked Baisley to the crime. Police never gave up. They continued with a high-profile search in 2013, but they failed to find his body.
Well, police are resuming their search this morning for the remains of Donald Mackay, who disappeared 36 years ago. Dozens of officers have started excavation work at a property in the southwestern New South Wales town of Hay. Now, it's believed the anti-drugs campaigner was murdered in the car park of a Griffith hotel in 1977.
The murder of Mckay changed the Australian mafia as much as it changed policing. Crime author Keith Moore says after that point, there was an order to keep a low profile.
The real powerful mafia people in Melbourne tended to be have much more modest houses and be a lot more powerful. And the Mckay murder was one of the reasons for that, in that the Clanbrine Mafia had a reasonably good run of not coming to anyone's attention very much for a lot of years. And the Mckay murder brought so much heat on them. 2 separate Royal Commissions, the Woodward Royal Commission followed by the Nagle Royal Commission, because Barbara Mackay kept pushing for more answers. And there was such massive heat on them that they literally had a board meeting of the bosses and said, never again will we kill someone as high profile as Donald Mackay, unless there's an incredibly good reason to do so. You know, they like working in the background and not drawing attention to themselves. And you know, the Mckay murder taught them that.
Moore says that the Griffith Mafia's rise to power was fueled by Australians' love of marijuana in the 1960s and 1970s. The Italians were farmers in their home country, and they turned their skills to pot. Griffith was the perfect spot. Plenty of sun and access to irrigated water. Mckay, a furniture store owner, was angry about the corruption in his town. He ran for the Liberal Party in 1974, concerned that the mafia had infiltrated political circles. His preferences helped unseat the local Labor MP, but then he went further. He had tipped off police about a $60 million crop in 1975. During the following court case, tragically, his involvement was revealed. They even made public that police had used his shop as a headquarters for their operation.
He was standing for a member of the Liberal Party, and he was his main platform was, we've got to do something about the marijuana problem in Australia, particularly in Griffith, where an awful lot of fairly poor Italian farmers and a bloke called Robert Trimboli was amongst those people, suddenly went from having small weatherboard houses to massive mansions with, you know, fountains and lions at the gate, and they were famously called grass castles because they were obviously built on the money made from marijuana.
Those huge homes on farming blocks in New South Wales showed the arrogance of the Griffith Mafia. They'd forgotten the lessons and disciplines ingrained in them in Italy.
They did, and look, and that was one of the mistakes. I think they probably thought they were invincible, and plus an awful lot of them did come from very poor families, and you know, all of a sudden they found these riches, and it was just too much for them to hide it. And you know, most of them had reasonable sized families, and you know, a big house is something that was on their agenda, and you know, certainly it's what alerted Donald Mackay and others that you know, there was something not quite right when all of a sudden they were knocking down weatherboard houses and putting up very big ones.
Mackay's disappearance remains one of the biggest mafia stories in Australia. The key mafia figures there all had alibis, and investigations, particularly without that body, stalled. But the questions kept piling up. How can a prominent local be shot in a pub car park and nobody see a thing? And was there more than one person involved? Could one man carry a dead weight? The smears of blood on the car suggested that the killer or killers struggled.
Well, today, Mr. Justice Woodward's report did find that cannabis growing and distribution is a large-scale industry in New South Wales operated by 2 migrant groups, Calabrians and Lebanese, with farms at Griffith, Thirlmere, Mudgee, Goulburn and Dubbo.
That was a news report after the Royal Commission into Mackay's death. Tony Sergi, who died in 2017, was another of the Ndrangheta bosses accused of ordering Mackay's murder. He was interviewed in 1979 after the findings came out and raised questions about his wealth.
I've been working here in this farm. I've been here now for 24 years and a half, nearly 25 years on the same place. And I've been for 27 years, and I've never done nothing wrong by nobody. Just to live in peace with my own family. I've got 4 children, my wife, my mother and father. In this house here, we live 2 families. My mother and my father, they live downstairs, and we live here upstairs. That's what I want to say.
There were others in Griffith who complained they were the target of racism. They argued that because they were Italian, they were treated differently.
Like, if you're driving around in a new car, they reckon you're a grass grower. If you build yourself a new house after you're living in shacks for about 20 years, that's a grass castle. You reckon that's very nice?
Colin Mclaren was an undercover detective who went looking for answers about Donald Mackay's death. We'll hear more from him later, but he has some important points to make about the disappearance.
I still think about that case. It was very well handled, the investigation back then by very, very good detectives. I know some of them. But the politics was really bad, and in the end, it all got down to dollars and cents, and they stopped spending money on the mafia. But what was achieved up until when they stopped was very, very good work. And I had, I guess, the pleasure and misfortune at the same time to talk to Donald Mackay's wife, and she was really very emotional when we chatted. And all she wanted was an answer to the death of her husband. And I spoke with the family members as well, and they were suffering. And when I was speaking to them, it was some 15 years later, and it was very emotional. It still is emotional, I think, for that family. It still hasn't delivered all the answers, but in the end, we tried in our task force to get some answers for them, and we weren't overly successful on that issue, but we were successful in other issues. But the mafia, really, it needs a full-time commitment, not just a little, part-time go at them every time a bomb goes off.
I asked the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission for an interview about the mafia for this podcast. They were unable to put anyone up to speak. However, they did provide a detailed statement. The Commission, which brings together information from across Australia and the world, confirmed that the mafia was still active.
We are committed to tackling serious and organised crime in Australia, and we work through a number of joint initiatives that bring together government, private sector and regulatory stakeholders to target the key criminal threats to Australia. Italian mafia remain active in Australia and are involved in significant drug trafficking, money laundering and other criminality. The level of their criminality varies between states and has remained largely consistent in recent years. They collaborate extensively with other higher threat organised crime cohorts in Australia, especially OMCGs. Mafia-related drug and money laundering activities in Australia tend to be directed by Australian members rather than from Italy, but they still maintain familial and criminal links here.
But the Crime Commission would not be drawn on whether they had enough resources. There is a debate raging about whether tougher laws on airport staff are needed, demanding they have a tighter security screening. The Commission did confirm the mafia remained a significant problem, and just a few weeks later, we would find out just how big that problem was. More than 40 years after Donald Mackay's murder, the mafia still has the upper hand. There have been some amazing undercover jobs, but what, if anything, can stop them? What are the FBI and the AFP working on?
I spent, upwards of $1 million just buying drugs, giving away money that was all photocopied and photographed and used and proved later for evidence.
But more on that in the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. This podcast was hosted by me, Stephen Drill, and produced by Andrea Teese Evanson.